Hello, everyone, and welcome back to GLIAC Weekly, your update for all things GLIAC football with insider Tony Nicolette. Riding shotgun with Tony this week, I'm Chuck Bittner, standing in for Matt Witwicky, who's getting a much-needed break from some of his podcasting duties with D2 football. However, if you tuned in just to see Wit, don't worry. You can still catch him on Inside D2 Football and NSIC Weekly and MIAA Weekly. But Tony, we're here to talk some GLIAC football. We had a couple of very interesting games from week one that we're going to recap, and then we have a very full slate to look forward to in week number 2. So let's go ahead and dive into it and look at some of the top games from this past weekend. And this one that we're going to kick off with, Tony, I think was one of the most exciting games in all of D2. Michigan Tech with a 52-50 overtime win. What a journey for the Huskies to get the victory in this game.
Geez, I guess. And, we talked about this one a little bit on Inside D2 Football, on Sunday night, just from the standpoint that when you see 52-50 scores, there's usually a story there. And sure enough, there was. I mean, you start with just the quarterback play in this one. Both quarterbacks from both clubs going for 5 touchdowns apiece, both going well past 400 yards. Alex Freese for Michigan Tech puts up that 457. That's a school record. Which, when you think about it, his coach was a heck of a quarterback for the Huskies. There have been some other good guys who've played and had long and storied careers there. So for him to grab a hold of that school record was quite the accomplishment. And then, of course, you've got the receiving trio there. Ethan Champney had a monster game, catching passes. Darius Willis did his usual day at the office. Brandon Michalak had a big day. So, I mean, you saw Michigan Tech fight and scratch and claw. They were down 21 3 separate times in this game and still found a way to win. And I guess ultimately, when I think ahead to the rest of the season, awesome for Michigan Tech to get the victory. But now this is 2 straight weeks where a lot of carries and not a lot of yards. So, last week, I think it was 23 carries, 19 yards. This is 29 for 25. I mean, the average is not good. And so, if they're going to start trying to get some wins once the GLIAC slate starts, which is now only a few weeks away, they're going to have to figure out how to saddle up that run game and get it going.
Yeah, a lot of extra football played in these first couple of weeks for the Huskies, too.
Oh, my gosh. 2 straight overtime games. Yep, this one goes 4 periods, goes to the 2-pointers. And you see that there, too. I mean, South Dakota Mines ran 102 snaps. I mean, my gosh, that is a lot of reps.
That's a lot of work for a defense, for sure. But it was certainly a thrilling game, and certainly one that had our interest throughout the entirety of that one. Let's take a look at one of the other top games. I thought this was going to be a close game, or at least had the potential to be a close game. It kind of looked like that early on, but boy, then the Cardinals just really kind of took control of this one late in the first half.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, though, Chuck, your instincts are correct, because if you really go back and look at the stats, this was actually a relatively even matchup. I mean, as far as total yards, time of possession, both teams were pretty close to each other. And in fact, I think Winona even had more first downs than Saginaw did. The difference, or the key to this game, was Saginaw Valley cashed in when they had opportunities and really made things difficult for Winona to either get those opportunities, let alone cash in on them. And so, you could see there, they shut them out in the second half. The Cardinals defense really played a stout game. But, if you look at, there were 6 scoring drives that Saginaw Valley had in this game. 4 of those drives all ended in touchdowns and took a grand total of 8 plays. Now, you say, how on earth do they do that? Okay, well, they had an 89-yard touchdown run by Mason McKenzie in his first college start, unless he snuck one in on us last year. I don't think he did. But and then he had an 88-yard touchdown pass at one point. So they had 2 monster plays, and then they took advantage of 2 very short fields. So those 2 long scoring plays, I think that was a total of 3 plays or 4 plays on those 2 drives, and the balance of those 8 plays came on those short fields. So if you really look at the body of work that Saginaw did across the rest of that game, they had 1 pretty solid drive, and a lot of it was punting. So, this was actually a somewhat uneven output for Saginaw Valley, even though the score looked kind of lopsided. So we'll be interested to see, how Coach Brady dials the kids in This is one of their many road games that they've got. So they're going to have to go out on the road and face tough opponents. And obviously they went out and found a way to get the win. And as McKenzie gets his feet under him, he'll continue to improve. But, this is one where Saginaw minimized the mistakes. That +3 in the turnover margin is going to win you a lot of ball games. That's what they're going to have to keep going, especially if the offense is going to lack that little bit of consistency.
Yeah, for sure. And we do expect Winona State to be a winning football team this year. So a quality win for the Cardinals going out of conference. Let's take a look at some of the other results from the weekend, just to recap in its entirety. Yeah, some mixed results with the GLIAC going up against the Great Midwest. We had Tiffin kind of taking care of business against Wayne State. Wayne kind of got some touchdowns there a little bit late to make that look a little bit more competitive, but really Tiffin's game to take. Northern struggled at Kentucky Wesleyan. Davenport had a nice lead on Thomas More, but the Saints really made him work for it there at the end. So I'm really curious about what that'll mean for Davenport heading to Bowie State this coming weekend. And then we had kind of the two juggernauts, Grand Valley State 58-0 over Central. Any takeaways really you would want to mention from that game? It looks like a really lopsided score, but anything that you would kind of take away from that one?
Well, I'll touch on a couple of things. Northern was actually in that game with Kentucky Wesleyan until basically the end of the first half. So that's 2 straight weeks where, against Duluth, you kind of knew they were going to be overmatched, and yet they still kept it tight. And this one, they did the same thing. So you got to cling to that hope for Northern that, okay, with all the youth that they've got on that team, they're going to get a few pieces put together and find a way to play some second halves that might give them a chance to win some ball games. And then, as far as the 2 big games there, as far as Grand Valley and Ferris State doing what they did, nothing particularly of note really when it comes to the results themselves. I mean, those are pretty much expected. I mean, those were 2 teams that Ferris and Grand Valley had pretty well overmatched going in, and I think we all knew that. There's going to be a little bit more that we'll talk about in regards to Ferris here coming up. And then with Grand Valley, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, okay, they got the new offense put in. How's that going to work with expanding the pass game? Because they really didn't have to do that in this game. I mean, they ran for well over 500 yards. I think they were a few yards short of the school record for rushing in a single game. So they didn't show a whole lot, and they didn't have to just because they were physically overpowering for Central State. And as far as Davenport goes, it's funny you mentioned that game. That's kind of their brand a little bit. I mean, they have a tendency to jump on some teams, and then they hold on for dear life at the end. We saw that in quite a few GLIAC games over the last couple of years, too. I mean, I can remember a game against Tech where they had Tech down like 38-14 or something like that. And the next thing you know, they're scrambling to try and get a field goal or score a late touchdown to try and win. So Davenport has a tendency to jump on some folks. So for the same thing for them, they got to figure out how to play a more complete game for 60 minutes. And that's going to what they're going to need to be able to take that next step forward in the GLIAC.
Sure. And I think for the Ferris State game, that seems like it could have been as ugly as they wanted it to be. I think it was 35-3 at the end of the first quarter. Kind of a get right game for the Bulldogs that they needed. And we'll talk a little bit more about them. Let's look at some player acknowledgments for some of the outstanding play. We talked about Michigan Tech. We talked about the Saginaw game. Here are your GLIAC players of the week. I know you touched on these a little bit already, Tony, but boy, just some outstanding performances here.
Yeah, Freeze, we've talked about both on the Sunday night show and here. So, I mean, again, just, school record. Anytime somebody puts up a number like that, they're going to be the odds on to get a league nod like that. Mitch Middleton, made all 8 of his PATs and did a great job on kickoffs for Ferris. But Eli Gordon, he's a name we don't really talk about because you think of the Kretzinger and the Rawls and the Dailies, that linebacking core for Saginaw Valley. But Eli Gordon's a safety who's, he's a known quantity within the Cardinal locker room. But in this game against Winona, man, he was everywhere. A couple of pass breakups, an interception, a fumble recovery, even blocked a field goal. I mean, the guy was just all over the place. So when you do that many different things at that many different spots on the field, you're going to get some recognition for that. And he had a huge impact on that result for Saginaw Valley, including setting up a short field for one of their short touchdown drives that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, so those are your conference players of the week in the GLIAC. A few others that you wanted to give some acknowledgement to for some performances over the weekend, just a few other discussion topics to bring forward.
Yeah, sure. Well, we talked about Davenport. Myron Harris has been a stalwart in this league. And one of the things I love about this guy is it doesn't matter what uniform he's wearing. He's just consistent. He had a couple of years at Wayne State where he was a heck of a good producer, makes the move over to Davenport last year, has a great season. and he's off to a great start again this year. When Davenport maybe was still trying to figure things out on offense in terms of the split between DeJuan Mathis and Micah Harrell, who's going to get what snaps at quarterback, how consistent are they going to be or not. Hey, Myron's still back there lugging it 22 times for $111. I mean, when you've got a back that you can count on, who can carry the load for you, that's super important, especially as the season starts to wear on. So that was cool to see him continue the high level performance that he's had. On the other side of the slide there, we've got a picture of Khalil Eichelberger. So he was one of 4 running backs for Grand Valley that had 84 yards or more and at least 1 touchdown in that game. We talked about the incredibly high rushing output that they had. 3 of those dudes went over 100 yards. So he led the way with a $119 and a couple of scores, but it was a fantastic rushing performance for Grand Valley in their opener. And then, a hot topic, here for us for this week is Ferris State. Now, Trinidad Chambliss, had some struggles down at Pitt State, and I mean the whole team did. It wasn't just he, but he sure had that bounce back or that get right game that you mentioned earlier. 3 passing touchdowns, 2 more on the ground, and his workload is probably going to increase because I was actually at that game and then watched watched the replay again a few different times. Carson Gulker was on our Elite 100 list for this year. And they were splitting series in both of these games, especially in this Lake Erie game. And Carson had an unfortunate injury where he ended up leaving in an ambulance. It was a lower body injury. It was nothing with his head or his neck or anything like that. I think it was a leg injury, but we don't know exactly what the outcome of that is. We can only speculate. But boy, it sure seems like if you leave in an ambulance, it's a pretty good bet that you're not going to be playing at least for a few weeks. So the role of that leader and that primary quarterback is going to really fall on Chambliss moving forward, because even though Coach Anise really loves having multiple guys, I'm not so sure that he's got that one next guy waiting in the wings. You think back in the past, guys like Travis Russell, there was always kind of that third guy, and they may have him, but we haven't really seen him yet. So this is going to be really interesting to watch and see what happens with how they're going to supplement giving snaps to other people in their games, as well as how does Chambliss mature into that leadership role as he kind of gets thrust into it, maybe at a more accelerated pace.
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting dynamic here. I mean, we know obviously the plan all along coming into the season was for Trinidad Chambliss to play a lot.
Yeah,
we already saw that at Ferris. We saw it even in the second game before Carson's injury where he had to depart. So they obviously have a lot of confidence in him. He's out there for a reason. Very talented football player, but now having to step into that role of, kind of the leader of that offense when you take away a veteran like Carson Gulker, who just can't be out there for however long that ends up being, it definitely changes the dynamics. And to your point, it is typically a 2 quarterback system. Do they have that second quarterback now to step in and provide sort of that change of pace that they normally like to go to? So it definitely makes it very, very interesting to keep an eye on Ferris, as if it wasn't already very interesting to watch what the Bulldogs are doing. It'll be very fascinating to kind of see how that offense evolves in the coming weeks. And actually, we're going to spotlight their upcoming game. So that's our recap on the week 1 in the GLIAC. Let's start looking at what we have coming up this Saturday. And Tony, this sort of feels like the old days when we get into conference play and we had eight games every week. Those were busy days for, writing the GLIAC. I wrote the PSAC in those days. It was 8 games every week. We have a full slate. Everybody's in action.
Horrible flashbacks, man. That was a lot of writing, a lot of editing, a lot of digging. But the funny thing is, Chuck, is we talk about how this is like back to that time. Look at all the GLIAC old folks weeks that we've got. We got Hillsdale and Tech and Findlay and Wayne. I mean, we got all these games that actually feature former GLIAC foes anyway. So it makes it even more like 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, these first couple of weeks are sort of like GLIAC alumni week. Or cast-offs, however we want to call that. Let's talk about some of these real briefly. We're going to spotlight a couple of these coming up a little bit. I think one of the ones, just looking at the list here, that we don't necessarily have a spotlight on, but it's very interesting to me, is Roosevelt, because they are one of the few teams in Division II that has not yet played. This is going to be their first action of the season, taking on Division III, University of Wisconsin Whitewater. This is a top 5 D3 team. Don't be fooled by the D3 there next to their name. This is going to be a very tough game for Roosevelt. I have to think they're probably a substantial underdog in that.
Yeah, and while I don't like to agree with you there, I think I probably will have to, just because this is actually the first ever game I believe that they will ever play against an NCAA opponent. They've only ever played either NAIA or schools that have other affiliations. This is the first time that they're playing an NCAA opponent, other than their North Central game last year. So, or maybe it's the first time that they're hosting one. I forget. I read Josh's stat sheet. Now I'm not remembering it very clearly, so he'll have to forgive me. It's been a long travel day, but it's definitely a series of firsts for them, and this game counts for that as well. And yeah, they did play North Central last year, and it didn't go too smoothly for them. So obviously, Whitewater and North Central kind of live in that same stratosphere when it comes to the D3 world. So this is going to be really interesting to see, how they come along. Again, they've had the extra week of camp, so to speak. We talked about this on the GLIAC preview show, that they do have a quarterback who's coming back that's got some starting experience. They are going to have to replace a ton on the offense in terms of the skill positions, other than their wideout Keontae Nixon. So moving the ball is going to be a challenge. So they're going to have to really lean on that defense to see if they can slow Whitewater down. And very few people do that. So this is it's a big step for their first season in D2. And what's funny is they don't play a D2 opponent until GLIAC play starts on October 5th. So they're going to play all kinds of interesting folks here over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of a fascinating start to their tenure in Division II. Similarly, we have Northern Michigan going to Wisconsin La Crosse. That's another highly ranked Division III opponent. They actually did play last year as well, I believe, in the Dome. Again, a result that didn't go very well for Northern Michigan. Do you think this can be a more competitive game this year?
I'd like to hope so. Again, I think Northern's got some work that they've really been putting in. Shane Richardson's been pushing those kids hard and really trying to turn some corners here. So having them be at least a little bit more competitive is certainly something that we're hoping for. And La Crosse, they're no stranger. I mean, they will take on anybody. They played Grand Valley a couple of years ago. They played Wayne State within the last year or two. And what's funny is they're at home for Northern Michigan this week. They actually go to Grand Valley next week. So La Crosse is a team that is just not afraid. And like I say, they bat a decent average within the GLIAC teams that they've played. So this is still an uphill climb for Northern based on what we've seen from them so far.
Well, we kind of joked about some of the former GLIAC teams coming back into the picture this week. How about Findlay going to Wayne State? The Oilers coming off a great season opener for them a week ago, going to Truman State out of the GLVC. Got a very impressive win there against the Bulldogs, who are always among the top 2 or 3 teams in the GLVC. Yeah. Great road win for them going to Wayne State.
It was. I was when I saw that result, it definitely made me raise an eyebrow, because again, I would typically associate just that slight level of physicality being increased with a Truman or an Indianapolis, and that didn't seem to be the case in this game. Findlay did a great job of controlling the trenches, and that's going to be something that they're going to have to do against Wayne, because Wayne's still got big bodies and guys that can move things around on the offensive line, and that's their strongest suit coming into this year. So while I think this could be an uphill climb for Wayne State, I'd love to see just how well Findlay maintains after that big win last week. And are they maybe looking too far ahead into their GMAC schedule? Don't look past the Warriors. They still got some dudes down there, and Coach Wheatley's really working to try and build something that can be competitive week in and week out.
All right. And Hillsdale, another former GLIAC program, heading to the Upper Peninsula to take on Michigan Tech. We talked about the start to the season they've had. Hillsdale, pretty rough intro to the season for them. They really kind of struggled against Indianapolis. Again, UIndy, one of the top teams in the GLVC. That's kind of been their personal playground last couple of years. But boy, the Greyhounds really got all over the Chargers in that one.
Yeah, and Indianapolis, as we all know, has some elite level quarterback play, and so they can obviously throw the ball with some of the best teams in the country, and that does not bode well for Hillsdale, given that Alex Freese has proven that he can sling it around the lot. The only question becomes is, does Hillsdale figure out a way to key on that, given the fact that Tech just so far has shown no propensity to be able to run the ball with any efficiency. So that's still, for as much as I like Tech in that game, they're still going to have to figure out how to move the ball on the ground, at least some.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I agree with you. I think that there's a chance for that to be a pretty competitive game, but we will see how that one plays out. All right, now we've got some games also there on the schedule we want to take a little bit of a closer look at. So let's take a look at the tail of the tape. Northwood and Saginaw Valley State, of course, former GLIAC rivals, still rivals. They're only about 25 miles apart, but do compete in different conferences now. I love the fact that they do still play each other. Tony, Northwood hasn't won in this rivalry since 2017. I think they're probably still the underdog here, but this feels like it could be a more competitive game than it's been the last couple of years.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and that's part of why I think we put that on here. Obviously, we talked about on the Sunday show that Northwood's one of those teams that you kind of have a shine for this year, and I don't blame you. They took some steps forward last year. They were decidedly more competitive in the new coaching regime than they had been in the last handful of seasons, especially as their time in the GLIAC was coming to a close. This is one of those games where it used to be a complete throw out the records type of rivalry. They play for the Axe. That's still called the Axe Bowl. And the fact that they kept this game on the schedule despite them being divergent in terms of what conference affiliations they had, I think is fantastic for both administrations to do that. But this used to be one of those games when I covered it in the GLIAC so many years ago that, there were times, believe it or not, Northwood was the better team than Saginaw. Both through the early part of the aughts and even some of the early teens. Northwood had some good clubs, and there were a couple times where Saginaw went through a coaching transition or two where they were having some down years. And, man, you threw those two teams on the field, and the one that had the losing record for the year would be the one that came out on top in this game, and it meant everything. I mean, it is one of those – it is a very fierce rivalry. Probably doesn't get the same notoriety as maybe a Northwest Pitt State or a Grand Valley Ferris or even a Tech Northern. But this is very heated and very, very, that proximity breeds that contempt. And this has always been one of those killer games that seems to always be close and come down to somebody making a tough play late in the game to be able to spring it. So, again, I mean, I think when you start to look at this game and how it stacks up for this year's edition, obviously, Northwood is starting to figure some things out on offense. They've been far more consistent. They've been far more balanced, which that was always the trick with them, right? Back when Coach Riepma was running the Woodbone, they run for a gajillion yards a year. But, boy, you get into a playoff situation where you play against teams that had good discipline and good sideline-to-sideline speed. That lack of balance really became penal. That isn't the case anymore. They actually, again, as you can see last week, they threw for far more than they ran for. So that's the first time I've seen a Northwood stat line that looks like that in quite a long time. And Saginaw Valley is going to have to be ready for that. Again, this isn't the same old Northwood that they, would be used to preparing for. And again, I think from the Saginaw Valley perspective, I think, okay, Mason McKenzie got his first start. He got that under his belt. Terrence Brown still had a good game with a touchdown on the ground and another. Saginaw Valley control the pace and the tempo and actually put together those sustained drives that they kind of didn't do as good a job of last week at Winona. I think that's going to be the difference here is if they can keep Northwood from getting any kind of jump going and control the trenches, I think that's going to be Saginaw's key here.
I agree. I think this can be a more competitive game, and I'm actually just going to pull Tony down for a second, see if I can bring him back up to see if we can refire the video on the feed there. I agree. I think this can be a competitive game. Northwood got their season off to a very good start in week 1, getting a road win at Gannon in a game that they very much controlled throughout most of that contest. So see if we can pull Tony down once more. See if we can bring him back in. I think Tony's joining us from some hotel Wi-Fi, so he may have a few difficulties there. If we still have the audio, then we are good enough. We don't need to see the smiling faces. Let's look at our next game, Tony. We've still got you on the audio, so we will roll with that. Ashland and Ferris State. We actually kind of addressed both of these teams a little bit earlier. We talked about this game on Inside D2 Football on Sunday night. Ashland kind of had a rough outing against IUP in their opening. Ferris, of course, we've talked about them a little bit. This feels like it should be Ferris's game, but Ashland seems to have a way that they can prepare and play the Bulldogs pretty tight. So what do you see in this one?
Yeah, so again, this is one of those rivalries that dates back to the old GLIAC, so to speak, and it's one of those things that Ashland always seems to know how to give Ferris State fits, and so that's part of why we still highlighted the game. I was not ready for the result that obviously I picked Ashland to be a bounce back team, and I picked them against IUP last week, but for them to go out and not be able to run the ball just surprised the heck out of me. And that is not a winning formula when you're going to try and play against a Ferris offense that is going to be as potent as it is. Trinidad Chambliss last week against Lake Erie. And again, I don't want to confuse Lake Erie and Ashland as far as their defensive prowess is concerned, but man, they look fast. They look crisp. Guys were open. Passes were on time. They were accurate. And so if Ashland's going to try and have any hope in this game, they're going to have to run the ball. And they're going to have to put points on the board. And, that output that they had last week against IUP just does not bode well for them. So, again, I think Ferris kind of had their get-right game last week. This is what Ashland's looking for here. It's just really hard to expect to go into top tagger and get right against the Bulldogs, even though you've got a history of giving them a hard time.
I agree, and yes, I feel the same way. It's kind of hard for me to get past the IUP result in week one. Now, IUP is a very good defensive football team. They always are. They're physical and they're fast, but that just ratchets up a few levels when you go against a Ferris State. So I actually don't think this is going to be a very close game in this one. But nonetheless, like you said, it's a rivalry. There's history there, and you never know what can happen.
No doubt about it.
That. All right. Now, this game, I think, is going to be very close. Davenport going down to Bowie, Maryland to take on the Bulldogs. We talked a little bit about Davenport's opener. Bowie State opened on the road at Lenore-Rhine, a very difficult place to go to. The Bulldogs love to challenge themselves. They like to get out of conference and play tough teams. Did that last week. Didn't really go well, but I also kind of feel like that's the type of game that can make them better, the type of game that they can learn from. So I think this is a very difficult road trip for Davenport. Bowie is a team that protects their home field extremely well. A small field, small home stadium, but a very difficult place to play, Tony. I've been there a couple of times. Very good atmosphere, and it gets loud in there, even though it's a small stadium. And this is going to be a tough road trip for the Panthers.
Yeah, I agree. And part of what we like about this game is that, we kind of felt like Bowie maybe was a little bit on the come as they got through the end of last year, especially after being, a national quarterfinalist just a few years ago. And this is a game, again, you say Bowie likes to get out and challenge themselves. I'll give credit for Davenport. They scheduled some tough ones so far this year, too. And I think this is on the list. For as much as Bowie's got that 0-1 record and some of their stats don't look all that good, let's not lose sight of the fact that they went on the road to a national semifinalist from last year.
Right.
And like, Coach Poe talked about on the Sunday night show, playing at Lenore-Rhine is no joke. That is just a different ball of wax. And so for Bowie to get down there, figure some things out, and come into this game, I guarantee you the Bulldogs think they can win this game. And so for Davenport, obviously Myron Harris is going to be critical, getting some consistency at that quarterback play, figuring out who between Mathis and Ohoro is going to be the guy who takes more of the snaps, but also then can start to establish maybe a little bit more firepower in the pass game. They've got some good weapons on the outside. Demetrius Garrett, Preston Smith, neither one of them did a whole heck of a lot in that first game against Thomas More. I think we're going to have to look and see if they can start to pass the ball with a little bit more efficiency on the outside, and they've got the speed and the weapons to do it. Just getting the ball out to them, I think, is going to be key for Davenport.
Yeah, I agree with you. And Bowie State typically traditionally a very strong defense. I think we'll see a bit more from them this week, maybe than we saw with some struggles against Lenore-Rhine last week. So I think this is a very competitive game.
Yeah, I agree.
It should be a fun one. All right. Well, we have one more to spotlight here, Tony, and obviously it's the game of the week for the GLIAC, but it's one of the top games in Division II this week. We have Grand Valley going to Colorado State Pueblo. This is a top 25 matchup. Thunderwolves jumped into the top 25 with their impressive win over previously ranked number 15 UT Permian Basin. They won that game. Late night affair with a lightning delay in the Thunder Bowl last Saturday night, but a great win. I was actually very impressed. Also not so impressed with Permian Basin and some of the mistakes they made, but Pueblo's defense made a lot of plays. The passing offense is pretty crisp, not as much in this last game, but Devin Larson at quarterback, a transfer from Western New Mexico, kind of a big impact player for them. They have a couple of receivers that really stand out on that Thunderwolves offense. And of course, we know what this game produced last year in Lubbers, just a nail biter in a high scoring game, lots of high flying action. I don't know if this one's going to be quite as high scoring, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out.
Well, no, I mean, to your point, I mean, Devin Larson's already shown, through 2 games that he's there for whatever Pueblo is going to let him do as far as slinging around the lot. When you've got guys like Reggie Retzlaff, who's big, physical, and can fly, I mean, it makes it really easy to get big plays out of the pass game. Now, I with all due respect to Permian Basin and South Dakota Mines, I don't know that those pass defenses or those defenses in general are going to be quite as difficult to move the ball against as Grand Valley's is going to be. Grand Valley's back end is loaded with all GLIAC talent from last year, guys that actually were in the portal and ended up deciding to stay. And then you've got, pass rushers like Niles King and whatever else. I think Grand Valley's defense is going to be the difference in this game, just in terms of the nature of the athlete that they bring and the ability that they have. But I think the other key to this game too is how well does Grand Valley establish the run game. They did that really well early last year and then kind of got away from it as the game unfolded. And then, of course, then you had a couple of special teams blunders by the Lakers and an interception. They got returned for a touchdown, and all of a sudden, Pueblo scores a whole bunch of points in a flurry, and it's a ball game. His quarterback room got more and more dinged up. It just became harder and harder for the Lakers to scratch and claw and hang on for that win. What we typically had seen over the years when Pueblo and Grand Valley got together was Grand Valley being able to be more physical in the trenches. I'll be real interested to see if that plays out similarly in this game because, again, Pueblo has continued to restock its roster. They're a little more aggressive through the portal than Grand Valley is, so they could have plenty of guys that the Lakers haven't seen much of yet, and Coach Vihil's going to have them ready to say, hey, you might come in here and think you're going to bully us, but that's not going to happen tonight. So it'll be a real interesting game to watch. I think, the fact that this is going to be, again, the first time that Pueblo's seen teams that have the athletic ability that at least matches, if not exceeds what they have, is going to be an interesting challenge for them. And again, Grand Valley, new quarterback, new offensive coordinator, not a lot of snaps in under duress so far this season. So, it's going to still be a challenge for both teams to figure out, okay, how do we go up there and win this one?
Yeah, and for Pueblo, that they think they can compete for the RMAC championship this year. All the attention, of course, is on Mines, and it was actually Western Colorado who got a few votes of confidence as a potential conference champion this year. But I know the Thunderwolves think that they can be a major player in the RMAC. What better way to make a statement to your rivals heading into conference play than to put up a big performance at home against Grand Valley? So we know that they're going to be ready for it.
Yep, no doubt about it.
Well, this will certainly be one of the highlight games on Inside D2 Football on Sunday night, so be sure to join Tony and myself Sunday night for the full recap of everything happening in Division II. I'm sure this will be one of our leading games, and then we will be back with you next week. We'll give you the full recap on all the games that we just talked through, and then we'll look ahead to the Week 3 schedule. Tony, before we close it out, any closing thoughts heading into Week 2 for the GLIAC season?
No, I'm just excited for Roosevelt to be joining the party and having them get into the fray a little bit. And then obviously, as we inch our way closer to GLIAC play, that's really when things get interesting. But I'm still glad to see all these different unique teams that the GLIAC teams are getting out there and finding a way to schedule. There's still actually some really interesting non-conference games still floating out there in front of us too. So, but this is the first week that all 8 teams are playing and might be the only one prior to conference play where we get all 8 teams playing. So it's a full slate and a whole wide array of different types of opponents. So it's just really fun. I think it's good for D2. I think it's great to see some of these conferences playing each other in formats other than the playoffs.
Without a doubt, I'm excited for it. It's going to be a busy weekend. Again, you can catch us on Sunday night for Inside D2 Football. He is Tony Nicolette, your resident GLIAC insider. I'm Chuck Bittner in the host chair, and we will see you Sunday and next week for GLIAC Weekly.